St. Peter's Square is silent. A soft wind brushes through the columns millennial from the Vatican, while the bells of the basilica resound like an echo of eternity. There are no speeches. There is no promises, only tears, glances at the sky, and a feeling strange in the air, brimming with history. Pope Francis has dead. But what if your death was not just the end of a pontiff? What if it were, in reality, the fulfillment of an ancient forgotten prophecy that marks the end of an entire spiritual era? Since centuries, there are whispers about an enigmatic list attributed to a Bishop Irish of the 12th century, a series of mysterious phrases, prophetic mottos, which seem to predict the names, symbols, and characteristics of each pope since the year 1143 until today. This prophecy has remained in the shadows, fueling debates between theologians, mystics, and skeptics. But now, with Pope Francis's departure, the world looks again at that dusty manuscript with new eyes. Because according to the prophecy, he was not just another pope, he was the last. In the last persecution of the Holy Roman Church, Peter the Roman will reign, and then will come his final judgment. That is the one final message of the prophecy of Saint Malachy, and for centuries it has been a source of fear, fascination, and controversy. Some the dismissed as an invention late, others like an encrypted warning from the sky. But what is happening today? It is undeniable. There are too many coincidences, too many signs. Francis, the first Jesuit pope, the first in carry the name of the Saint of Assisi, was also a leader who divided opinions. Loved by many, criticized by others, he lived a papacy marked by crises global, internal tensions, and unexpected decisions. Among them, the most symbolic of all, its wish not to be buried in the Vatican, breaking with more than 1 century of tradition. A personal gesture or a prophetic break. The prophecy he spoke of a final pope, of a time of tribulation, of Rome enveloped in spiritual fire. Today, with the Peter's chair empty, the question becomes inevitable. Are we living the end of the papal lineage, or simply the principle of the end? This is not a conspiracy story. It is a journey through symbols, dates, and coded messages that have stood the test of time. And if you dare to continue, you will discover that what seemed like a medieval story without importance could be the key to understanding the most disturbing present of the Church and the world. Because the death of Pope Francis is not only the closing of a cycle, it is the resurrection of a prophecy that no one wanted it to come true. Year 1139. A bishop Irishman travels to Rome, called by Pope Innocent II. His name, Saint Malachy, a mystic revered for his gifts of prophecy, healing, and spiritual vision. During his stay in the Eternal City, according to the tradition, has a series of profound visions, images, symbols, and cryptic phrases that would correspond to each pope who would govern the Catholic Church until the end of the times. Malachy writes what you see in a list of 112 Latin mottos, each assigned to a future pontiff. These mottos do not mention names, but signs, characteristics of the papal coat of arms, references to cities' birth, spiritual symbols or events that would mark their pontificates, a kind of prophetic code that is impossible to decipher until it comes true. This manuscript, according to some accounts, it was delivered directly to the Pope of the time and remained hidden in the secret archives of the Vatican for more than 4 centuries. It was not until 1595 that the text appeared published in a book entitled Lignum Vitae, written by a monk Benedictine called Arnold de Wyon. And this is where it begins the controversy. Was it really a prophecy of the 12th century or a forgery of the 16th century? The skeptics. They claim that the first 74 slogans prior to the publication are surprisingly accurate, perhaps because they were written after the facts. But what is truly disturbing is that the slogans that came after 1595, when they could no longer be manipulated, either they seemed to be mysteriously right. For example, intrepid faith, the fearless faith was associated with Pius IX, a pope who defended key dogmas in times of war and revolution. De Labore Solis, from Job of the Sun, corresponds to John Paul II, born and died during solar eclipses. Elidi, Gloria Olivae, the glory of the olive tree, was linked to Benedict XVI, whose order Benedictine is a symbol of peace and olive tree, and after he, silence. There is no a motto 113, just one final phrase, ominous, different from all the previous ones. During the last persecution of the Holy Roman Church, Peter the Roman will reign, who he will feed his sheep in among many tribulations, past the which the city of the 7 hills will be destroyed, and the judge terrible will judge his town. End. A total break in a prophetic pattern. No symbol, no metaphor, only judgment, fire, and the end. And for years, scholars tried to understand, who is Peter the Roman? Why doesn't he have a number like the others? And why? The prophecy ends with he, many. They imagined that the next pope, after Benedict XVI, would be called Peter. Others, they thought he would be Italian, Roman by birth, but then appeared Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis, Argentine, Jesuit, and without he name Pedro in its title. Apparently nothing fit, until they remembered details that would change the perspective. The father of St. Francis of Assisi, from whom Bergoglio takes the name, his name was Pietro, and as Pope, Francis declared himself not a prince, but Bishop of Rome, a title that links him directly to the city of the 7 hills, Rome. Coincidence, symbolic forcing, or a veiled clue in the line of the ancient prophecies? Be that as it may, the mystery remains. And now that Francis has died at the age of 88, a symbolic number of double infinity, of closing a cycle, the prophecy of St. Malachy, it is read again, whispered, feared, because according to the manuscript, there is nobody after him. For centuries, the world expected the last pope to be a man called Peter, an apocalyptic pontiff, Roman, born in the heart of the empire, which would rule the church between flames and ruins. But when Jorge Mario Bergoglio appeared in the balcony of San Pedro, many do not they saw come. An Argentine pope, son of Italian immigrants, the first in choose he named Francisco, the first Jesuit, the first of the hemisphere south. How could he is Peter the Roman? At first it seemed absurd, but the more I looked into it, the more things began to emerge. The symbols, not them names literal, but the hidden signs. Francisco chose that name in honor of St. Francis of Assisi, a figure of humility, poverty, and spiritual reform. But few remember that St. Francis' father was called Pietro di Bernardone, a rich Roman merchant who renounced his son when he rebelled against material values. Ao adotar o nome do filho, Francisco is symbolically carrying the name of Pai, Pietro. Furthermore, unlike his predecessors, Francis always insisted on presenting himself not as Pope, but as Bishop of Rome, the oldest and most essential title of the papal office. And Rome, with its 7 hills, is the final scene of Malachy's prophecy. So we have Se Pietro by symbolic lineage, Roman by title and jurisdiction, a world in crisis as planned, and a death that seems to contain not just a life, but an entire era. And since it was not enough, Francis is scheduled to be buried in the Vatican. He chose, from now on, to rest in another place. A decision that, in addition to being unprecedented, has enormous spiritual weight. Previous popes rested under the Basilica of San Pedro, a symbol of continuity and authority. Francisco, no. He breaks the cycle. How it is said, this is where the road ends. Now, during his papacy, 2 symbols of power were also distanced. Troku, or throne, adorned by a wooden chain, open to the golden ring, living in a simple house within the Vatican, and brought together by 2 poor and marginalized people. For the distracted eyes, gestures of humility, but for your attentive eyes, It seems that he was not preparing the church to continue, but to be transformed. The prophecy of Saint Malachias is true, so Francisco was hardly more than one. Elephoi, or final frame, the border between the era of the traditional church and the beginning of a time of celebration. And here a question arises that begs even the most skeptical, whether Francisco was Peter or Roman. Or what do you see next? A prophecy ends with destruction, persecution, and judgment. There is no mention of another successor. There is no relief. There is no hope, unless, as some interpret, this FIM is not physical, but spiritual. The end of the church as a structure, the birth of a new form of faith. In this scenario, Francis would not have been just the last pope. It had been the prophetic clock's Pontero, touching the zero moment of spiritual humanity. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio converted in 2013, the world was already in the Popus in the midst of turbulence. But few, they imagined that his pontificate would be crossed by a chain of global events that would seem coming out of an apocalyptic script. Under his leadership, the humanity faced one of the most devastating pandemics of the century, the of COVID-19. Empty churches, masses digital, funerals without faithful, the image of a solitary pope praying under the rain in St. Peter's Square is empty gave the around the world. Many they saw in that scene a prophetic symbol, as if Francis were praying not only for the living, but for the future of the own faith. Then came the war. Ukraine invaded. Russia rekindling fears of nuclear war. The Pope, silent mediator, calling for peace while the sound of the bombs was superimposed on the prayers. And it didn't stop over there. Climate crisis on the rise. Historic droughts, fires, forests, floods, earthquakes. Meanwhile, Francis was publishing encyclicals denouncing the destruction of our common home, the planet. But his warnings, they seemed fall in ears deaf. Even within the own church, his pontificate was marked by internal scandals, divisions doctrinal, conflicts with conservative sectors, and a growing sense that Catholicism was no longer an undisputed beacon of moral authority. In parallel, the world witnessed the unstoppable rise of the artificial intelligence, questioning the role of the soul, of free will, and of spiritual ethics. Francis was one of the first religious leaders to warn about the dangers of a technology soulless. But was it already too late? Some theologians began to speak openly that we were living the pains of the birth of a new spiritual era, and the words of the Pope himself, in several times, they seemed give them the reason. We are facing a change of era, not just an era of change. The world is not in an era of peace. It's at war, a piecemeal world war. Words that don't seem to come from a traditional pontiff. They seem to come from a tired prophet, aware that the system is collapsing and that his role is not to prevent the collapse, but to accompany it, the transition. All this coincides disturbingly with the description of the prophecy of Malachy: extreme tribulation, persecutions, destruction of the city of the seven hills, not just talking about physical wars, but about a symbolic break, a spiritual shock. And while many focused in searching for a literal Peter, the symbolic Peter already, he walked among us, leading the flock in half of the fire. Maybe it wasn't the apocalypse in flames, but an apocalypse of meaning, a purification, an internal judgment. With the death of Francis, some ask, have we passed already the tribulation? Or was it just the prelude to something much bigger? Sometimes, what is hidden is not hidden. It is in plain sight, wrapped up in gold, incense and songs. So it is with many of the symbols of the Catholic Church, rituals repeated for centuries that, when observed with others' eyes, they seem sacred codes intended to reveal something deeper. From the choice from the Pope to his funeral, every gesture is loaded with meaning. But in the case of Francis, these symbols acquired a different force. It was as if his pontificate had activated a dormant spiritual dimension, awakening questions that for centuries remained under the silence of the Vatican. One of the spaces more mysterious is the St. Peter's Basilica, built over the tomb of Apostle, the first pope according to the tradition. There, every stone seems to whisper history, and each work of art is a visual parable. But what few they know that, in its exact center, under the main altar, is located the called Peter's Confession, a sacred crypt where they lie relics that supposedly belong to the apostle. It is there that the popes, upon assuming the throne, they descend in silence, in solitude as to pray, a ritual that not only seeks humility, but also marks the connection with the origin of Roman spiritual power. Francisco did this ritual. But then he broke with the continuity, choosing not to be buried in that same sacred place, as if said, "Here ends the line, here it breaks the chain." His decision, it was more than symbolic, it was theological. Papal robes also are rich in meaning. The mitre, the tall hat that evokes the crown of the ancient high priests, the ring of the fisherman, which represents Peter as a fisher of men, the use of the pallium, that stole with black crosses, which points out the pastoral burden of the Roman leadership. Interestingly, Francisco simplified her clothing. He rejected the papal tiara, a symbol of triple power, spiritual, temporal, and universal, and opted for more austere white suits, a visual break, but also a spiritual one. Even at the liturgical level, his papacy introduced changes that made conservative sectors uncomfortable: open-air masses without rigid formalities, inclusion of women in roles of liturgical visibility, openness to other religions and even to people without declared faith. Some interpret these gestures as modernization, others as signs that the temple is being dismantled from within. The Sistine Chapel, where the cardinals they elect the Pope to, contains a disturbing detail. In the fresco of the Last Judgment, painted by Michelangelo, Christ appears not as Redeemer, but as cosmic judge, with a violent gesture, sending souls to heaven and hell, a constant reminder that papal power is not eternal, it is subject to divine judgment. All of this leads us to a disturbing conclusion. Symbols are not there just for decoration. They are talking, shouting, warning. And maybe Pope Francis, more than anyone else, it understood. Maybe that's why chose a farewell that does not perpetuate the tradition, but rather marks a threshold, a ritual end, a symbolic end, a prophetic end. The prophecy of Saint Malachy is not alone. Throughout the history, other visions, messages, and revelations have emerged from different parts of the world, many times without apparent connection, but with disturbing resonances. And when placed side by side, it's as if each of them was a piece of a same puzzle, one that points toward an irreversible change in the spiritual history of the humanity. One of the best known is the third secret of Fatima. In 1917, 3 Portuguese children claimed have received messages from the Virgin Maria. The last of those messages, it was hidden by the Vatican for decades until it was finally revealed in the year 2000. The text spoke of a bishop dressed in white who walked among ruins praying for the dead, and then I would be murdered. The Vatican interpreted this as an allusion to the assassination attempt on John Paul II's life. But many independent scholars suggest that the vision it has not been fully fulfilled, and that the bishop in white can represent a pope in times of extreme tribulation, just like Francis. Other found in ancient spiritual warning is the Book of Enoch, an apocryphal text attributed to Noah's great-grandfather. In he describes visions of the heaven, divine punishments, and an end time where the righteous would be separated from the wicked. Enoch talks about fallen angels, technology prohibited, and a judgment imminent. It more shocking is that for centuries, this book was excluded from the canonical Bible, except in the Ethiopian tradition. But in time, recent Din has been recovered by theologians, mystics, and scholars who see in his words a warning for the modern age, and say of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Discovered in 1947, these ancient texts written by the Essenes, a Jewish mystical community, contain descriptions of a great final war between the children of light and the children of the darkness. They speak of a master of righteousness and the collapse of a corrupt religious system, a narrative that, symbolically, seems to reflect the conflicts current within the own church. Even the Apocalypse of John, the last book of the New Testament, describes a symbolic Rome called Babylon, a rich but doomed city of 7 hills, where the kings and merchants of the world weep his fall. Isn't that an image eerily similar to the prophecy of Malachy? These texts, although separated by centuries and languages, coincide in something essential. The spiritual world is found on the verge of a profound transformation. Traditional leadership will be challenged, purified or destroyed, and a judgment not only external but internal will fall upon the humanity. By weaving all these prophecies together, a possibility emerges that transcends the literal. Maybe the end is not an event, but a silent process, a mutation that is already underway. And Francis, as a prophetic figure, can having been the catalyst for that transformation, a pope who did not seek impose his will, but to dismantle structures, soften rituals, and let the history flow toward a destination not yet revealed. What if all the prophecies were talking about the same moment? What if that moment is now? Pope Francis is dead, but his absence has left something more than a physical vacuum in the Peter's chair. It has opened a symbolic portal, a crack in the history, an awkward pause in the heart of the church. For centuries, popes have been seen as guardians of the faith, bridges between the human and the divine. But now, with the prophecy of Saint Malachy resonating like an echo in the hallways from the Vatican, many are wondering, has it arrived? The end? The death of Francisco, his refusal to be buried in the Vatican, his pontificate marked by crises global, his humble and prophetic figure, everything seems to fit in a narrative that goes beyond the human, a narrative that speaks of cycles, of closure, of judgment. But what if all this didn't mean destruction, but transformation? The prophecies, they can be interpreted in many ways. Some announce chaos, others redemption, but they all coincide that change is inevitable. Perhaps the true prophecy is not about the collapse of an institution, but about the awakening of a new one, spiritual awareness. Perhaps Peter the Roman is not a man, but an archetype, an energy that closes one cycle for another can begin. In this story, the real protagonist is not just Francis. It is the humanity whole. It's us, those of us who must decide what to do with the signs, symbols, and warnings. It's us who we choose whether to continue clinging to the past or to open ourselves to a new era of light, understanding, and renewed faith. Just because the last pope has spoken, the next message will no longer come from Rome. It will come of the heart of each one of us. And and you, what do you think? Do you think that the prophecy of St. Malachy has been fulfilled? Has the era of the popes ended? Or is a new era just beginning? Comment below your opinion. Share this video with who they look for the hidden truth. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we continue exploring the mysteries that the history and the faith they tried. Be quiet.